My name is Susan Williams. I'm 61 years old. And last month, my own son slapped me 15 times in front of his wife. He did it in the dining room I built with my late husband's hands, surrounded by the furniture I polished every Sunday. Each slap was followed by her laughter, a sound that cut deeper than the pain itself. They thought I was powerless, that I had nowhere else to go. But what they didn't know was that the house they humiliated me in was still mine. That Sunday had started like any other. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft golden patterns on the kitchen walls. I had woken early, as I always did, to prepare lunch for my son Mark and his wife Jessica. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, one of those rare moments when families gather, eat, and share simple laughter. I had made his favorite chicken pie with extra thyme, just the way he used to love it when he was little. Back then, he'd sit on the counter swinging his tiny legs, watching me cook and asking if angels ate food too. That memory felt like another lifetime. Now Mark was 39. His face had hardened with the years, his smile replaced by a constant tension that never seemed to leave him. Jessica, on the other hand, had the kind of charm that could melt anyone's defenses, anyone but mine. There was something behind her polished smile that always felt calculated, something cold and rehearsed. Still, I tolerated her for Mark's sake. After all, peace was worth more than pride, wasn't it? Or so I had told myself for years. Jessica arrived first, wearing a perfume so sharp it made the whole house feel smaller. She carried a store-bought cake, the cheap kind with too much frosting, and placed it on the table as if it were a peace offering. "For you, Mother Susan," she said with that brittle smile. "Thank you, dear," I replied. Even though I could see the mocking glint in her eyes, she knew I didn't eat sweets because of my diabetes. She knew it well. Mark arrived 30 minutes later, slamming the front door so hard the frames on the wall rattled. His jaw was tight, his movements quick and sharp. "Rough day?" I asked gently. He didn't answer. He tossed his keys onto the counter and sank into the chair like a storm ready to break. I wanted to say something comforting, but over the years I had learned that silence was often safer than sympathy. We began eating in uneasy quiet. The clinking of forks against plates echoed through the room. I tried to lighten the mood, mentioning that the roof had started leaking again. "Maybe you could help me call someone to fix it," I said softly. His fork stopped midway to his mouth. "The roof in my house, you mean?" The tone in his voice made my stomach twist. "Mark," I said carefully, "this was our family home." "Your father don't bring Dad into this," he snapped. "You live here because of my generosity. Don't forget that." Jessica's lips curved into a slow smile as she took a sip of her wine, pretending not to listen but enjoying every word. My throat tightened. I wanted to remind him that I had paid for this house, that after my husband died, I had sold the small apartment we'd shared for 30 years to help Mark buy this bigger place. He was the one who suggested putting it in his name for tax reasons. I trusted him. A mother always trusts her son. But I also kept the original deed tucked safely away in my dresser drawer, a silent piece of paper that now felt like the only ally I had left. "It's just a leak, Mark. You don't have to—" "Don't tell me what I have to do," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The plates jumped. Jessica chuckled under her breath. "Have you forgotten," Mark continued, his voice growing louder, "that you'd be in a nursing home right now if it wasn't for me? You should be grateful." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling under the table. "I am grateful," I whispered. "Then act like it." He stood up suddenly, towering over me. His eyes were dark, almost unrecognizable. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." When I lifted my gaze, the first slap came sharp, sudden, shocking. The sound echoed off the kitchen tiles. I froze. My son, the child I had carried, nursed, and protected, had just struck me. "Mark," I breathed, but before I could say more, the second slap came. Then the third. Jessica covered her mouth as if in horror, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. By the 5th blow, my face was burning. By the 10th, I stopped counting. 15 times. 15 strikes from the same hands I once held to teach him how to write his name. He stepped back, panting, his chest rising and falling. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," he said coldly. I sat there still, my ears ringing, the room spinning around me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply felt something inside me harden, a quiet, icy resolve forming in the space where love had just died. Jessica leaned toward him. "Come on, honey," she said sweetly, patting his arm. "Let's not ruin the evening. She'll learn." They both walked to the living room, leaving me sitting there with the untouched plates and the bitter smell of betrayal hanging in the air. When I finally stood up, My legs were trembling. I walked slowly down the hallway to my bedroom, every step echoing like a goodbye. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. For a long time, I simply stared at my hands. They were shaking not from pain, but from the weight of realization. The boy I raised was gone. The man who replaced him was a stranger. I touched my swollen cheek and let the tears fall silently. They weren't tears of weakness anymore. They were tears of clarity. That night as I lay awake, I remembered the drawer in my dresser, the one where I kept the old folded piece of paper. The house deed still under my name. They thought they owned me because I lived under their roof, but in truth they lived under mine. A slow, cold calm settled over me. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the beginning of something new. I would no longer beg for love or respect. I would claim what was mine. Outside, the night was still. The moonlight fell across the dresser where that document waited patient and silent. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel helpless. I felt powerful. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the hallway wall. My face still throbbed from the blows. And when I looked in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. My left cheek was purple and swollen, and the skin under my right eye had turned a faint shade of blue. But beneath the bruises, something else had changed. My gaze was no longer soft or pleading. It was steady cold. I moved quietly through the house, careful not to make any noise. In the kitchen, I made a cup of tea and sat at the table, the same table where yesterday my son had shown me who he truly was. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the windows when I heard Mark's alarm go off upstairs, then the shower running, then his heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. He walked past me without a word, opening the refrigerator, his back to me, as if I were invisible. This was how it had been for months now, maybe years. Me fading into the background of their lives, a convenience and afterthought. But today was different. Today, I wasn't going to fade. "Morning, Mark," I said, my voice steady. He grunted in response, not turning around. "I made an appointment to fix the roof today," I continued, sipping my tea. Now he turned his expression annoyed. "I told you I'd handle it." "No need," I replied calmly. "I've got it covered." His eyes narrowed slightly, unused to this new tone from me. But then Jessica called from upstairs, and whatever he might have said was forgotten as he grabbed his coffee and headed out the door. "Don't wait up," he called over his shoulder. "We're having dinner with the Thompsons." I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before I picked up the phone. My first call was to Sarah Jenkins, a lawyer recommended by my neighbor. She agreed to see me that afternoon. "Bring the deed and any other paperwork you have," she said. Her voice was warm, professional. "And Mrs. Williams, you're doing the right thing." My next call was to Michael Chen, a real estate agent known for his quick sales. "I have a beautiful 4-bedroom in the Oakwood area," I told him. "I'd like to list it immediately." "That's a desirable neighborhood," he replied. "We could have offers within days." "Perfect," I said, "and I'd prefer a quiet listing. Family situation." He understood immediately. Of course. Some sellers prefer discretion. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting across from Sarah in her office, the original deed spread out on the desk between us. She examined it carefully, then looked up with a smile. "This is quite clear, Mrs. Williams. Despite what your son might believe the house is legally yours, his name is nowhere on this deed." He told me putting the house in his name was better for taxes. I explained, feeling foolish now for having believed him. Sarah's expression softened. "That's a common tactic, unfortunately, but you were smart to keep the original paperwork. Now about these bruises." She gestured toward my face, her expression grave. "Have you considered filing charges?" The thought made my stomach clench. "No," I said firmly. "I just want to move on. Sell the house, start over." She nodded, respecting my decision. "In that case, we need to move quickly. If your son realizes what you're doing, he could make things difficult. Do you have somewhere to go after the sale?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. My world had been this house for so long. "My sister lives in Austin," I said finally. "Maybe I could stay with her until I figure things out." "That's a good start," Sarah said. "Now let's talk about how to protect your assets going forward." For the next hour, we discussed bank accounts, power of attorney, and legal protections. By the time I left her office, I had a plan. Not just for selling the house, but for reclaiming my independence. Michael Chen met me at the house that afternoon while Mark and Jessica were at work. He walked through each room making notes, taking pictures. "Beautiful craftsmanship," he remarked, running his hand along the built-in bookshelf my husband had made. "You don't see this quality anymore." "My husband built most of it," I said, feeling a pang of nostalgia. "James was a carpenter." "He was talented," Michael said. "Now, given the market and the condition of the house, I'd recommend listing at $375,000. We might even see higher offers if we get multiple interested parties." The number took my breath away. When James and I had bought our little apartment decades ago, it had cost us $45,000, and we'd thought that was a fortune. The idea that I now had access to such a sum was almost impossible to grasp. "How soon can we list it?" I asked. "I can have it up by tomorrow morning," Michael replied. "And if you're willing to do an open house this weekend, we might have offers by Monday." It was happening so fast, but I knew speed was necessary. Mark and Jessica couldn't know until it was too late to stop me. "Let's do it," I said. That evening I began packing secretly. Small things at first. Photo albums, James's old watch, the hand-carved jewelry box he'd made me for our 20th anniversary. I hid the boxes in the attic where neither Mark nor Jessica ever ventured. As I sorted through decades of memories, I found myself letting go not just of possessions, but of the illusion that my son was still the boy I'd raised. The truth was staring me in the face as clearly as the bruises he'd left Mark was not the person I thought he was. And I was not the woman they thought I was either. The next morning, the house was officially listed. By noon, Michael called to say we already had 3 showings scheduled for that afternoon. "I'll need you to be out of the house from 2 to 5, he explained. "That's perfect," I said. "Mark and Jessica won't be home until after 6. I spent those hours at the library researching places to live in Austin. Small apartments, retirement communities, even tiny houses. For the first time in years, I was planning for myself not around Mark's needs or Jessica's preferences. The freedom was dizzying. By Saturday, we had 5 solid offers, all above asking price. The highest was from a young couple expecting their first child. $410,000 all cash, and they can close in 3 weeks, Michael told me excitedly. "It's an excellent offer, Mrs. Williams." I thought about a new family starting their journey in this house, replacing the bitter memories with new hopeful ones. "Tell them yes," I decided. All that remained was to tell Mark and Jessica. I chose Sunday dinner, the same setting where everything had changed. I prepared Mark's favorite meal again, not out of habit or obligation this time, but as a final goodbye to the woman I once was. They arrived together, Mark immediately reaching for a beer from the refrigerator, Jessica scrolling through her phone at the table, neither acknowledging me until the food was served. "This looks good, Mom," Mark said, his voice neutral. The bruises on my face had faded to a yellowish green, but neither of them had ever mentioned them. It was as if the incident had never happened, or perhaps more troublingly, as if it had been so insignificant it wasn't worth discussing. I waited until they were both eating before I spoke. "I have some news," I said calmly. "I've sold the house." Mark's fork clattered against his plate. "You what?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Sold the house," I repeated. "Closing is in 3 weeks. Jessica laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "You can't sell this house. It's not yours to sell." I met her gaze steadily. "Actually, it is. The deed is in my name. It's always been in my name." Mark's face flushed dark red. "That's impossible. When I bought this place, I corrected him gently. "With the money from selling the apartment your father and I owned. You suggested putting it in your name for tax purposes, but I never did. The paperwork is with my lawyer." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the calculations happening behind Mark's eyes, the desperate search for a way out, for a way to maintain control. "You can't do this," he finally said. "Where will we live?" "That's for you to figure out," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice remained. "Just like I need to figure out where I'll live." Jessica turned to Mark, her eyes wide with panic. "She can't be serious. Tell her she can't do this." But I could see in Mark's face that he knew I was serious, and worse, that I could indeed do exactly what I said. His anger came next, predictable as a summer storm. "After everything we've done for you," he shouted, rising from his chair. "Taking you in, giving you a home." I didn't flinch. "This was my home long before it was yours, Mark. And what you did last week showed me exactly how much I'm valued here." His hand twitched at his side, and for a moment I thought he might strike me again. But something in my expression must have warned him against it. Instead, he knocked his chair over as he stormed out of the room, Jessica following close behind. I heard them upstairs drawers slamming, voices raised. They were already planning their next move, but for once they were a step behind me. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, packing, and quiet determination. Mark and Jessica barely spoke to me, moving through the house like ghosts, anger radiating from them in waves. They made a few half-hearted attempts to challenge the sale legally, but Sarah had ensured everything was airtight. "They have no grounds," she assured me. "The house is yours to sell." The night before closing, I sat in the living room alone, looking at the walls that had witnessed so much of my life. James and I had brought Mark home to our small apartment, but this house had been where we'd celebrated his graduation, where James had taken his last breath, where I had thought I would live out my days surrounded by family. Plans change. People change. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is recognize when a chapter is ending and have the courage to turn the page. The next morning, I signed the final paperwork in Sarah's office. "Congratulations," she said, handing me a check. "You're officially starting over." I looked at the amount, $402,300 after all fees and commissions. More money than I'd ever had at once in my life. Freedom in the form of numbers on a check. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked. I had been thinking about this question for weeks. My sister invited me to stay with her in Austin while I look for a place, but I'm thinking of something different. Maybe a small ranch outside the city. Some land, some peace. Sarah smiled. "That sounds perfect." I had already arranged for a moving company to pack the few things I was taking with me. My clothes, some books, the items I'd secretly boxed up. The rest would go to charity or be left for Mark and Jessica to deal with. I wasn't being vindictive. I simply didn't want to be weighed down by possessions that reminded me of a life that no longer fit. My flight to Austin was scheduled for that afternoon. I returned to the house one last time to collect my suitcase and say a final goodbye. I hadn't told Mark or Jessica when I would be leaving, hoping to avoid a scene. But as I wheeled my suitcase down the hallway, Mark emerged from the kitchen. He looked tired, defeated in a way I'd never seen before. "So you're really going?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." I paused, my hand on the door. "The new owners move in next week." He nodded, looking past me at the wall. "Jessica's parents said we can stay with them until we figure something out." I felt a twinge of something. Not regret exactly, but perhaps a shadow of the maternal concern I'd carried for so long. "You'll land on your feet. You always do." He met my eyes then, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flash of the boy he once was, the one who would climb into my lap with skinned knees seeking comfort. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked suddenly. "All these years, if you were unhappy. Would you have listened?" I asked gently. His silence was answer enough. "Goodbye, Mark," I said, opening the door. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He didn't reply, and I didn't look back as I walked to the waiting taxi. Some goodbyes don't need more words. Some relationships can't be fixed with a conversation. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is walk away and let everyone heal separately. The taxi driver loaded my suitcase into the trunk. "Where to, ma'am?" "The airport," I said, settling into the back seat. As we pulled away from the curb, I watched the house grow smaller in the window. The house that had been my cage and my shelter, my pain and my protection. I thought I might feel sadness or perhaps regret. But what washed over me instead was relief, pure and simple. The weight I'd carried for so long, the need to be needed, the fear of being alone, the desperate hope that things would somehow improve, all of it lifted from my shoulders with each mile that passed. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "Can't wait to see you. Your room is ready." I smiled, feeling the first genuine happiness I'd known in months. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. At the airport, waiting for my flight to be called, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window. The bruises had faded almost completely now, but the woman looking back at me was still a stranger in many ways. Stronger, certainly. More determined. Perhaps even a little wiser. Final boarding call for Flight 246 to Austin. The announcement crackled overhead. I gathered my carry-on bag and walked toward the gate, each step taking me further from the past and closer to whatever came next. I didn't know exactly what that would be, but for the first time in decades, the not knowing felt like possibility rather than fear. As the plane lifted off, I watched the city shrink beneath me, becoming a patchwork of tiny houses and winding streets. Somewhere down there was the house I'd just left behind with all its memories and pain. But up here in the clear blue sky, none of that could touch me anymore. I was Susan Williams, 61 years old, and I was finally free. The Austin air hit differently. Thicker, warmer, tinged with cedar, and something indefinably hopeful. My sister Catherine met me at the airport terminal, her arms outstretched, her smile wide and genuine. We hadn't seen each other in person for 3 years, though we spoke on the phone weekly. I barely had time to set down my carry-on before she enveloped me in a hug so tight I felt the bruises on my face pulse in protest. When she pulled away, her eyes widened as she noticed the fading yellow-green marks. "Susan, what happened to your face?" Her fingers hovered near my cheek, not touching as if afraid to cause more pain. I took a deep breath. "It's a long story. One I'll tell you, but not here." Catherine nodded, always perceptive. She grabbed the handle of my suitcase. "Let's get you home first." Home? Such a complicated word. Catherine lived in a modest 2-bedroom bungalow in South Austin, surrounded by towering pecan trees and a garden that seemed to explode with wildflowers. It was nothing like the pristine, manicured suburban house I'd left behind, but the moment I stepped through her door, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: safety. "The guest room's all yours for as long as you need," Catherine said, showing me into a small but cheerful space with a patchwork quilt on the bed and a window overlooking her backyard garden. I cleared out some closet space and the bathrooms just across the hall. I set my suitcase down, fighting a sudden wave of emotion. The kindness of having space prepared just for me after years of feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own home was overwhelming. That evening, over a simple dinner of grilled chicken and fresh vegetables from her garden, I told Catherine everything. About Mark's gradual transformation from the sweet boy she remembered into the cold man who'd struck me 15 times. About Jessica's satisfied smirk as she watched it happen. About the house and the deed and my escape plan that had worked perfectly. Catherine listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to anger to grief. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I always wondered why you stopped visiting as much after Mark married Jessica. Now I understand." I told myself I was giving them space, I admitted. But really, I think I was just avoiding seeing what was happening. It was easier to pretend everything was fine. "Well, you're here now," Catherine said firmly, "and we're going to figure out your next chapter together." The first week at Catherine's passed in a blur of administrative tasks. I opened a new bank account at a local credit union, depositing the check from the house sale. I got a Texas driver's license, registered to vote, found a new doctor and dentist. Small practical steps that anchored me to this new reality. During the days, Catherine worked as a high school English teacher, leaving me alone in her house. At first, the solitude was jarring after years of tiptoeing around Mark and Jessica's moods. I found myself speaking aloud to the empty rooms just to hear a voice, but gradually the silence became comforting, rather than isolating a space where I could hear my own thoughts without filtering them through someone else's expectations. I began exploring Austin, taking the bus to different neighborhoods, wandering through farmers markets and bookstores. The city hummed with an energy that invigorated me, so different from the sterile suburb I'd left behind. People smiled at strangers here. They made conversation in line at coffee shops. They noticed an older woman sitting alone and pulled up a chair to chat about the weather or books or the best place to find authentic tacos. One morning, about 2 weeks after my arrival, Catherine mentioned that a neighbor was selling a piece of property outside the city. "Just a few acres with an old farmhouse that needs work," she explained. "But Martha's hoping to sell to someone who'll love it rather than a developer who'll subdivide it. Might be worth looking at if you're still thinking about that ranch idea." The property was in Dripping Springs, about 30 minutes west of Austin. Catherine drove me there on a Saturday down winding roads that cut through hills covered in juniper and oak. As we turned onto a gravel driveway, my heart skipped. The small white farmhouse sat on a gentle rise surrounded by wildflowers and ancient trees. Behind it stretched several acres of open field bordered by woods. Martha Cooper was waiting for us on the porch, a tall woman in her 70s with silver hair cropped short and skin tanned from decades in the Texas sun. She greeted us with iced tea in mason jars, the condensation beating on the glass in the early summer heat. "So you're thinking of becoming a rancher?" Martha's eyes twinkled as she looked me up and down, taking in my suburban clothes and city haircut. I'm thinking of starting over, I replied honestly, and I've always wanted space to grow things. Martha nodded as if this answer satisfied something deeper than her teasing question. Well, let me show you around. The house needs work, I won't sugarcoat it. Been in my family since 1952, but I'm the last Cooper, and these old bones can't keep up with the maintenance anymore. She led us through the farmhouse, pointing out its flaws with the same pride that others might showcase features. The kitchen was outdated with chipped countertops and appliances from the 1980s. 2 of the 3 bedrooms needed new flooring. The bathroom had been renovated sometime in the early 2000s, but the plumbing throughout the house was temperamental at best. Yet beneath the wear and neglect, I could see the bones of something beautiful. Hardwood floors under layers of linoleum, solid pine beams spanning the ceiling, windows placed to catch both the morning and afternoon light. It wasn't a showpiece, but it had character, something my suburban house, for all its granite countertops and crown molding, had always lacked. Outside, Martha showed us the old barn, the chicken coop long empty of hens, and the vegetable garden now overtaken by weeds. Had quite the operation here once, she said wistfully. Grew most of our own food. Kept bees too over there by the east field. I found myself hanging on her every word, mentally cataloging what could be restored, what needed to be replaced, where new life could be breathed into this tired but dignified property. As we walked the boundaries of the land, I felt a stirring of excitement I hadn't experienced in decades. Here, under the vast Texas sky, I could envision a future unconstrained by others' expectations. What are you asking? I ventured when we returned to the porch. Martha named a figure that made Catherine gasp, but I remained silent, calculating. It was significantly less than I had from the sale of the house, leaving me a comfortable cushion for renovations and living expenses. It's worth twice that, Catherine protested, always the protective sister. Maybe to a developer, Martha acknowledged. But they'd tear down the house, cut down the trees, and put up a dozen cookie-cutter homes. I'd rather sell for less to someone who'll care for the place. Her gaze met mine, a challenge and an offering. Would you care for it, Susan? The question hung in the air between us, weighted with more than just the exchange of property. Would I care for this neglected piece of earth? Would I nurture it back to beauty? Would I put down roots here, start fresh, create something that was entirely mine? Yes, I said finally. I believe I would. 3 weeks later, I signed the paperwork, making me the owner of the Cooper farmhouse and its 5 surrounding acres. Catherine tried to talk me into staying with her while renovations were completed, but I was adamant. I need to live there even with the imperfections, I insisted. It's the only way I'll know what the house needs. What I need. The first night in my new home, I slept on a camping mattress in the living room, the electricity not yet reliable enough to risk using the aging wiring upstairs. The house creaked and settled around me, speaking in its own language of pops and groans. A chorus of insects sang outside the open windows, punctuated occasionally by an owl's questioning call. I lay awake for hours, not from discomfort or fear, but from a strange, buzzing anticipation. For the first time in decades, I was solely responsible for my environment, my choices, my future. The enormity of that freedom kept sleep at bay, my mind racing with possibilities. The next morning I woke with the sun, my body stiff from the thin mattress, but my mind clearer than it had been in years. I made instant coffee on a camping stove and carried it out to the porch, where I sat watching the mist rise off the fields as the day warmed. A cardinal flashed red against the green of an oak tree. A cottontail rabbit ventured briefly from the edge of the woods, then darted back to safety. This was mine, all of it. The worn boards beneath my feet, the wild tangle of the overgrown garden, the rusted weather vane atop the barn's roof. Not because someone allowed me to claim it, but because I had chosen it, paid for it, committed to it. The realization settled in my chest, both terrifying and exhilarating. That day I made lists. Immediate repairs needed versus cosmetic improvements. Tools I'd need to purchase. Skills I'd need to learn. The lists grew sprawling across pages of the notebook I'd brought, but instead of overwhelming me, they energized me. Each item represented a decision I alone would make, a task that would shape my new home according to my vision, not anyone else's. By the end of the week, I'd found a contractor willing to tackle the most pressing structural issues. Roberto Vasquez was in his 50s with calloused hands and eyes that missed nothing when he inspected the house. The foundation's solid, he confirmed after crawling under the house for an hour. Roof needs work before the fall rains come. Electrical's a fire hazard that needs addressing right away. Plumbing. Well, let's just say I wouldn't take too many long showers until we replace some of those pipes. His estimate was fair, eating into my savings, but leaving enough for the remaining renovations I hope to complete myself. I signed the contract that afternoon, and his crew began work the following Monday. For the next month, I lived in a construction zone, moving my camping mattress from room to room as Roberto's team tackled different areas of the house. The noise and dust were constant companions, but I didn't mind. Each bang of a hammer, each whine of a saw meant progress. My house slowly transforming from neglected to renewed. In the evenings when the crew left, I worked in the yard, reclaiming the garden inch by inch from the weeds and overgrowth. The physical labor was foreign to my body, and each night I collapsed into exhausted sleep. Muscles aching in places I didn't know could hurt. But each morning I rose eager to continue, my hands developing calluses, my skin tanning in the Texas sun. Catherine visited every weekend, bringing supplies from town and often staying to help. She watched my transformation with a mixture of amazement and concern. "You're working too hard," she cautioned one evening as we sat on the porch drinking lemonade and watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. "I'm working exactly as hard as I need to," I countered. "This isn't just about fixing a house, Catherine. It's about rebuilding myself." Her expression softened. "I know. I just worry. You've been through so much." "I've been through exactly what I needed to go through to get here." The words came unbidden, but as soon as I spoke them, I recognized their truth. Without Mark, without what happened, I'd still be sleepwalking through a half-life, waiting for permission to exist fully. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "Have you heard from him?" I shook my head. "Not a word. Not that I expected to. Mark never was one for acknowledging his mistakes." "Do you miss him?" Her voice was gentle, probing a wound we both knew hadn't fully healed. "I miss who I thought he was," I admitted. "I miss the boy who picked me dandelions and made me Mother's Day cards with too much glitter. But that boy is long gone, if he ever really existed outside my hopes for him." We sat in silence after that, the weight of lost dreams hanging between us. But as the stars emerged overhead, countless and brilliant in the clear country sky, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Some losses cleared the way for new growth. Some endings were necessary for better beginnings. By mid-August, Roberto's crew had finished the major repairs. The house had a new roof, updated electrical wiring that wouldn't catch fire at the first sign of strain, and plumbing that delivered hot water consistently. They'd also reinforced the sagging porch, replaced broken windows, and patched holes in the walls where various critters had made entrances over the years. The cosmetic work remained, painting, refinishing floors, updating the kitchen. But those were projects I intended to tackle myself, learning as I went. Roberto had shown me the basics of drywall repair, and Catherine had gifted me a subscription to an online home renovation course. "Just don't fall off any ladders when I'm not here," she warned as she helped me tape off the living room for painting. "I can't be driving out here for emergency rescues every other day." "I'll save all my accidents for weekends," I promised solemnly. We both knew she worried not just about physical injuries, but about the isolation. My nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road, an older couple who waved when they drove by, but whom I'd yet to properly meet. The farmhouse sat at least 50 yards back from the road, invisible to passing traffic. Cell service was spotty at best, but the solitude that concerned Catherine was precisely what I craved after years of walking on eggshells in my own home. Here I could sing off-key while painting. I could leave a project half-finished without apologetic explanations. I could eat cereal for dinner, or go to bed at 8 o'clock, or spend an entire day reading without feeling the weight of someone else's judgment. September brought cooler temperatures and new challenges. The vegetable garden I'd spent all summer reclaiming was finally ready for fall planting. I consulted books and local nursery owners, learning about succession planting, companion gardening, and the specific needs of crops in the Texas Hill Country climate. Each morning I spent at least an hour in the garden, kneeling in dirt that was gradually transforming from compacted clay to something looser and more fertile as I added compost and amendments. I planted spinach, kale, carrots, and beets, crops that could withstand the occasional frost but would thrive in the mild winter ahead. Inside the house, I tackled one room at a time, starting with the bedroom. I stripped ancient wallpaper, patched cracks in the plaster, sanded the hardwood floors hidden beneath decades of carpet, and painted the walls a soft sage green that reminded me of new growth. When it was finished, I splurged on a real bed, no more camping mattress, with a handcrafted frame made by a local woodworker and a mattress so comfortable it felt like sleeping on a cloud. The first night in my completed bedroom, I lay awake again, but this time from pure satisfaction. My hands were rough with calluses, my back ached from physical labor. But around me was a space created entirely by my own vision and effort. Not Mark's preferences, not Jessica's expensive tastes, but mine alone. The room was modest by their standards, no designer labels, no status symbols, but every inch of it reflected choices I had made freely. As fall deepened, I established routines. Mornings in the garden, afternoons working on the house, evenings reading or taking online courses. Twice a week, I drove into Austin for groceries and supplies, occasionally meeting Catherine for lunch or coffee. On Sundays, I explored the surrounding countryside, discovering hidden swimming holes, quirky small-town festivals, and roadside stands selling local honey and homemade jams. It was at one such stand that I met Martha Holloway, a woman in her 70s selling peach preserves and sourdough bread. We struck up a conversation about canning techniques, which led to an invitation to her weekly gathering of farm women, her term for the eclectic group of female property owners in the area. Some of us have been here for generations, some just moved in last year, Martha explained as she wrapped up a jar of preserves for me. But we all face the same challenges. Coyotes and the chicken coop tractors that won't start men at the feed store who assume we don't know the difference between alfalfa and Bermuda grass. I laughed, recognizing the last from my own experiences at the local agricultural supply store. Do you have to be a real farmer to join because I'm just getting started with my garden? Martha waved away my concern. Honey, if you've got dirt under your nails and determination in your heart, you're farm enough for us. Thursday evening's my place. Bring something to share if you can, but mostly just bring yourself. That Thursday, I found myself driving down an even more remote road than my own, following Martha's directions to a sprawling old farmhouse surrounded by peach orchards. I carried a batch of zucchini bread made from a neighbor's oversupply of summer squash, nervous as a teenager on a first date. 8 women sat in a circle of rocking chairs on Martha's expansive porch, ranging in age from mid-30s to well into their 80s. They greeted me with the easy warmth of people accustomed to welcoming newcomers, making space in their circle, pouring me sweet tea from a pitcher, sweating condensation in the evening air. "So you bought the old Cooper place," said an elegant, silver-haired woman who introduced herself as Elaine. "Been wondering who'd take that on. It's got good bones, but Lord knows it needed someone with vision. Or someone too stubborn to know better," added a younger woman named Jessie, her laugh taking any sting from the words. "I did the same thing 5 years ago. Bought a falling-down barn and 10 acres of neglect. My family thought I'd lost my mind." "Had you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Oh, absolutely," Jessie confirmed cheerfully. "Best decision I ever made. Nothing clears the head like having to figure out how to replace a well pump at 3 in the morning during a thunderstorm." The conversation flowed easily after that, jumping from practical advice about winterizing pipes to deeper discussions about the challenges and rewards of rural life. These women spoke a language I was just beginning to learn, of self-reliance tempered with community support, of working with nature instead of against it, of finding meaning in the rhythms of seasons and growth. As darkness fell and lightning bugs danced in the orchard beyond the porch, I found myself sharing more than I'd intended. About Mark, about the slaps that had finally awakened me from years of acquiescence about my journey to this new life. The women listened without interruption, without the awkward discomfort that such stories often evoke. When I finished, Martha reached over and squeezed my hand. "Honey, every woman sitting here has a before and after story," she said quietly. "Some involve husbands, some involve other losses, but we all reached a point where we had to decide whether to keep shrinking or start growing." Around the circle, heads nodded in silent agreement. These weren't women who pitied me. They were women who recognized my experience as part of a shared tapestry of female resilience. For the first time since leaving Mark's house, I felt not just safe, but understood. I drove home that night with a trunk full of gifts. Cuttings from perennial herbs, a dozen fresh eggs, a hand-drawn map of the best local swimming holes, and Martha's promise to bring her tiller over the following weekend to help expand my garden. But the most precious gift was the sense of belonging of having found my tribe in this unlikely corner of Texas. The farm women, as I came to think of them, became an essential part of my new life. Each brought different skills and knowledge. Elaine was an expert at preserving food. Jessie knew everything about native plants. Carol could fix almost any engine, and Martha seemed to hold the collective agricultural wisdom of 3 generations. They shared freely, teaching me to make soap from scratch, to recognize edible wild plants, to mend fences and predict weather patterns. In return, I offered what I could. My organizational skills honed from years of managing a household, my knowledge of budgeting and financial planning, and increasingly my labor. We formed informal work parties, gathering to help each other with projects too big for one person: barn raising, garden planting, tree clearing after storms. By November, my house renovations had progressed to the kitchen. With Carol's help, I tore out the aging cabinets and installed simple open shelving made from reclaimed wood. We kept the vintage porcelain sink but replaced the corroded faucet. The ancient electric stove gave way to a modern gas range, my one significant splurge. The work was physically demanding, and each evening I collapsed into exhaustion. But it was a satisfaction I'd never known in my previous life of maintaining appearances. This exhaustion came from creation rather than preservation, from building rather than enduring. On Thanksgiving, Catherine came to the farmhouse bringing side dishes to complement the turkey I'd roasted in my new oven. Martha and Elaine joined us, along with Catherine's new boyfriend, Richard, a soft-spoken history professor she'd been seeing for a few months. My dining room was still half-finished, the walls partially painted and the floor covered with a drop cloth. But we set up a folding table in the center of the room, decorated it with wildflowers and candles, and gathered around it on a mismatched collection of chairs. To new beginnings? Catherine raised her glass, looking pointedly at me. And old friends, I added, nodding to Martha and Elaine. And to houses that become homes, Martha concluded. We ate until we couldn't move, then sat talking as dusk gathered outside the windows. Richard entertained us with stories from his research into local history, including tales of the German settlers who had first farmed this land in the 1800s. They were escaping religious persecution, he explained, looking for a place where they could live according to their own values. Many of the women were widowed by the journey or the frontier hardships, but they stayed, forming communities of mutual support. Not so different from now, Martha observed, glancing around at our little gathering. After everyone had gone home and I was washing the last of the dishes, my phone rang, a rare occurrence given the spotty service at the farmhouse. I dried my hands and answered without checking the caller ID, assuming it was Catherine, making sure she'd retrieved all her serving dishes. "Mom," Mark's voice sent an electric shock through me. I hadn't heard it in over 4 months, not since the day I'd walked out of the house that was now sold to a young family expecting their first child. My hand tightened on the phone. "Mark," I kept my voice neutral, neither welcoming nor rejecting. "Happy Thanksgiving." He sounded uncertain, a tone I'd rarely heard from him as an adult. I wasn't sure if your number was still the same." "It is." I sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly needing the support. "How did you get my address for the card, I mean?" A pause. "Aunt Catherine, she said you have a farm now." "A small one, just getting started." I looked around at my half-renovated kitchen, wondering how to describe this new life to someone who had never bothered to understand my old one. "How are you, Mark?" Another pause, longer this time. "Divorced. Jessica left right after you sold the house. Turns out she was mainly interested in the lifestyle, not me." A complicated mixture of emotions washed through me. Vindication, sadness, a mother's instinctive concern for her child's pain. But beneath it all, a surprising realization: Mark's problems were no longer mine to solve. His choices, his consequences, his growth, all belonged to him now. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said finally, and meant it. No matter what he'd done, I wouldn't wish pain on him. "Yeah, well," he cleared his throat. "I'm in therapy now. Anger management. It's helping me understand some things. About Dad, about how I treated you. I just wanted you to know that." I closed my eyes, absorbing the impact of his words. This wasn't the Mark I knew. The Mark who never apologized, never acknowledged fault, never showed vulnerability. This was someone new, or perhaps someone very old. The boy who had existed before hardness calcified around his heart. "That's good, Mark. I'm glad. I'm not asking for forgiveness," he added quickly. "I know what I did was... There's no excuse for it. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be better." The silence stretched between us, charged with decades of complicated history. What does one say to a son who has struck you, who has betrayed you, who is now attempting some fumbling form of amends? No parenting book covered this territory. "Thank you for telling me," I said at last. "I appreciate it. Would it be okay if I called again sometime?" His voice had the hesitant quality I remembered from his childhood when he'd ask for a second cookie or another bedtime story, unsure of the response, but hopeful. I considered the question carefully. The new life I was building was precious to me, its peace hard-won. Did I want to reintroduce the complexity of Mark with all his unresolved issues and our painful history? But wasn't that growth too? The ability to engage with difficult relationships from a position of strength rather than fear. Yes, I decided. "You can call. But Mark, yes. I'm not coming back. This is my home now. My life." "I know, Mom." Something in his voice had changed, a note of respect I hadn't heard in years. "I can tell from the card. You sound different. Stronger." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time watching the night deepen outside my windows. Cicadas sang in the trees. An owl called from the barn. The old house creaked and settled around me solid despite its imperfections. I thought about growth, how it isn't always linear or predictable, how sometimes it requires cutting away dead wood to allow new shoots to emerge, how even the most damaged plants can often be coaxed back to health with the right care and conditions. Mark was attempting to grow. I was growing too in ways I couldn't have imagined 6 months ago. Whether our growth would ever allow our paths to truly reconnect remained to be seen. But for tonight, it was enough to acknowledge the possibility and to be grateful for the distance that made it safe to consider. The next morning I woke early as had become my habit. The November air was crisp, carrying the first hint of winter. I pulled on a sweater and boots and walked out to survey my little kingdom in the soft dawn light. The vegetable garden was thriving rows of greens vibrant against the dark soil. The flower beds I'd started around the porch were dormant now, but would explode with color in spring. The barn still needed extensive repairs, but its silhouette against the lightening sky had a dignified presence, a testament to generations of use and care. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Martha. "Freeze coming tonight. Need help covering those tomatoes." I smiled, typing back, "Yes, please. Coffee and muffins in exchange for labor." This was the rhythm of my new life. Problems arose, and instead of hiding them or bearing them alone, I faced them directly, asking for help when needed, offering it in return. Give and take growth and rest, work and celebration, balanced in a way my old existence never had been. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the fields gold and casting long shadows from the oak trees, I felt a surge of pure gratitude. Not just for the physical place, though I loved every acre, every weathered board, every struggling seedling, but for the internal landscape I was reclaiming. At 61, I was building more than a farm. I was building a self that had been suppressed for decades. Curious, capable, connected to both land and community. The woman who had sat silent and trembling under her son's blows seemed like a stranger, now a ghost from another lifetime. Martha's truck appeared at the end of my driveway, dust billowing behind it as she bumped along the gravel. I raised my hand in greeting, then turned toward the house to put on coffee. Another day of work and learning awaited. Another day of becoming more fully myself. The bruises had long since faded from my face. The deeper wounds were healing too slowly but surely, and in their place something new and green was growing, resilient, wild, and gloriously uncompromisingly mine. Winter in the Texas Hill Country arrived with a surprising bite. Having spent decades in the more temperate climate of suburban Houston, I was unprepared for the way cold seeped through the old farmhouse's walls, how the wind found every crack and whistled through rooms I thought I'd properly sealed. The first frost silvered my garden overnight, forcing me to learn quickly about cold frames and row covers to protect the more tender plants. Martha arrived the morning after that first frost, her truck loaded with spare lumber and sheets of clear plastic. "You're going to need these if you want to keep eating from that garden," she announced, already unloading materials before I'd even offered coffee. "Winter here plays tricks. 60 degrees one day, 20 the next. Gotta be prepared." Together we constructed simple structures over the vegetable beds, creating microclimates that would shield my carefully tended plants from the worst of the cold. My fingers grew numb as we worked, unused to the chill, but there was satisfaction in the labor, in seeing immediate results and knowing I was protecting something I'd nurtured from seed. "You're catching on quick," Martha observed as we secured the last sheet of plastic over the carrots and beets. "Took me 3 winters to figure out the rhythm of growing here." "I've had a good teacher." I stamped my feet to restore circulation. Several good teachers, actually. Martha's weather-lined face creased into a smile. That's the secret, you know. None of us were born knowing this stuff. We just found people willing to share what they'd learned. That evening, huddled by the wood stove I'd insisted on keeping during the renovations, I reflected on Martha's words. My entire life had been shaped by what others taught me, explicitly or implicitly. James had taught me to recognize quality craftsmanship. Mark had taught me the terrible cost of silence in the face of disrespect. And now these women of the Texas countryside were teaching me resilience, self-sufficiency, and the quiet power of community. I was proving to be an apt pupil in this latest curriculum. By Christmas, my once barren property had begun to take on a settled, intentional appearance. The house renovations were nearly complete, with only the second bathroom still awaiting attention. The garden, protected under its makeshift greenhouses, continued to provide fresh greens and root vegetables. I'd even adopted a stray cat, a rangy orange Tom who'd shown up during a rainstorm and decided the barn made an acceptable kingdom for His Majesty to rule. I named him Caramel for his coloring and his occasionally sweet disposition when it suited him. He kept the mouse population under control and provided company during the long winter evenings when darkness fell early and the rural isolation felt most acute. Like me, he seemed to appreciate having found a place where he could exist on his own terms, coming and going as he pleased, neither dependent nor truly alone. Mark called every few weeks, our conversations gradually evolving from awkward and halting to something approaching comfortable. He never asked to visit, seeming to understand intuitively that the fragile bridge we were rebuilding couldn't yet bear that weight. Instead, he shared cautious updates about his life, the anger management classes that had expanded into more comprehensive therapy, the promotion at work that recognized his talents without feeding his worst tendencies, the small apartment he'd found after selling what remained of the suburban house. I listened more than I spoke during these calls, still wary of slipping back into old patterns, the reflexive smoothing over the careful management of his moods. But I did share selective glimpses of my new existence, the vegetable garden's surprising bounty, the kitchen renovation completed just in time for holiday baking, the women's group that had become my unexpected community. "You sound happy, Mom," Mark observed during our Christmas Eve call. The simple statement caught me off guard. Was I happy? The concept seemed too frivolous, too unexamined for what I'd found here. "I'm at peace," I said finally. "I'm building something that feels right." A pause on his end of the line. "I've been thinking about what you said last time, about how we teach people how to treat us. I never realized how much I'd learned that from Dad. The idea that women should just absorb whatever men dish out." The mention of James sent a familiar pang through me. Not quite grief anymore, but a complicated mixture of love and regret for the man who'd been my husband Mark's father, a gentle carpenter with his hands, but sometimes careless with his words. "Your father wasn't perfect," I acknowledged. "None of us are. But he never would have raised a hand to me, Mark. That came from somewhere else." "I know." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "That came from me. My choices. I'm trying to understand why I made them, but I'm not excusing them." The admission hung between us, honest in a way our relationship had rarely been. I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps its precursor recognition of another's genuine effort to change. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly. We spoke a few minutes more, exchanging holiday wishes before hanging up. After the call ended, I sat watching the flames dance in the wood stove, Caramel purring on my lap, considering the strange journey that had brought me here. From a slapped face to a life reclaimed. The path hadn't been straight or simple, but each painful step had led me closer to this moment of winter stillness, this hard-won peace. Catherine and Richard joined me for Christmas dinner the next day, bringing armloads of presents and food. The house filled with scents of roasting turkey and pine from the small tree we'd decorated its lights, reflecting in the windows as afternoon faded to evening. "I can't believe how different this place looks from when you bought it," Catherine marveled, running her hand along the refinished banister. "You've done more in 6 months than most people do in years." I had motivation. I adjusted the centerpiece of holly and candles on the dining table, and a lot of help from the farm women. "Speaking of whom," Richard set down his wine glass, "I've been meaning to ask if you'd consider letting me interview you and your friends for my oral history project. The university's documenting the changing face of rural life in the hill country, and your perspective as newcomers carrying on traditional practices would be valuable." The request surprised me. In my previous life, I'd been invisible. The background figure at Mark's work functions the silent presence maintaining a perfect household. The idea that my experiences might have academic value, might contribute to a larger understanding of women's roles in rural communities, was both flattering and slightly unnerving. I can't speak for the others, but I'd be willing, I said carefully, though I'm hardly an expert. That's exactly what makes your perspective valuable, Richard explained. You're documenting the learning process in real time, bridging urban and rural knowledge. It's actually quite remarkable. Catherine squeezed my hand under the table, a silent affirmation of her partner's assessment. I felt a flush of pride warm my face. Not vanity, but the simple pleasure of being seen, of having my efforts recognized as meaningful beyond my own immediate needs. That recognition bloomed into something more tangible in the new year. What began as casual interviews for Richard's academic project evolved into regular gatherings where the farm women shared specific skills, canning summer produce, treating common livestock ailments, predicting weather patterns using natural indicators. Richard recorded these sessions, but soon other professors and students from the university began attending, eager to document what they termed disappearing practical knowledge. Martha, initially skeptical of the academic interest, gradually warmed to the project as she saw the genuine respect with which our visitors approached our expertise. "Never thought anyone would care about how my grandmother tested soil by taste," she admitted after a particularly well-attended demonstration of traditional planting methods. "Always figured that kind of knowing would die with us." "It would have if you hadn't shared it," I pointed out. "That's what makes knowledge different from information. It has to be passed person to person. Hands teaching hands." By March, these informal teaching sessions had gained enough attention that the university's community outreach program offered to formalize them, providing a small stipend and officially recognizing our group as community educators. The validation was nice, but what meant more was the opportunity to structure our knowledge sharing more intentionally, to reach people genuinely interested in reconnecting with practical skills our consumer society had all but abandoned. We named our initiative the Heritage Project and scheduled monthly workshops open to the public, each focusing on a different aspect of self-sufficient living, from bread baking with wild-caught yeast to basic home repairs that didn't require calling a specialist. Spring arrived in a riotous explosion of wildflowers, transforming the fields around my farmhouse into carpets of bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, and wine cups. The fruit trees Martha had helped me plant during the winter, peach, plum, and fig, put out their first tentative blossoms, promising future harvests. In the vegetable garden, winter greens gave way to the early plantings of tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants that would thrive in the coming heat. I expanded my growing area, adding a small greenhouse constructed from reclaimed windows and a dedicated herb garden near the kitchen door. The physical labor continued to transform my body. Muscles I'd never known I possessed, developing definition, my skin tanning despite the broad-brimmed hat I wore for protection. At 61, I was stronger than I'd been at 40, more confident in my body's capabilities, less concerned with how I appeared to others. The first Heritage Project workshop took place in my front yard on a perfect April Saturday. 23 people, a mix of university students, young couples, and retirees, gathered to learn about starting a vegetable garden in limited space. Martha led the hands-on demonstration while I provided handouts on succession planting and natural pest control methods. Watching the participants' faces light up as they got their hands in the soil, many for the first time, I felt a surge of purpose I'd never experienced during my years as Mark's background support system. These were strangers I might never see again yet in sharing what I'd learned. I was contributing something tangible to their lives, something that might spark further exploration, greater self-reliance, deeper connection to the natural world. "You've got a gift for this," Martha commented as we cleaned up after the workshop. "The way you explained companion planting made it simple without talking down to people." I had years of practice translating complex ideas into digestible pieces. I replied, thinking of the countless times I'd explained Mark's work projects to confused clients or simplified household budgets for Jessica's benefit. Skills developed in service to others were finding new expression now deployed for my own purposes. The workshops continued monthly through spring and into summer, growing in attendance as word spread. We rotated locations among the farm women's properties, showcasing different approaches to rural living. Elaine's immaculate homestead demonstrated heritage livestock breeds. Jessie's converted barn illustrated creative repurposing of agricultural structures. Carol's workshop focused on maintaining farm equipment with minimal specialized tools. My contribution beyond the gardening knowledge I was rapidly accumulating centered on the financial aspects of transitioning to a more self-sufficient lifestyle. Years of managing household finances had given me skills in budgeting, strategic planning, and resource allocation that proved surprisingly valuable to workshop participants trying to balance modern economic realities with more traditional living practices. Most people think they need to go all in at once. I explained during a July workshop held in my newly completed outdoor kitchen. Sell everything, buy 40 acres, live off-grid immediately. But that's a recipe for failure unless you have unlimited resources. The sustainable approach is incremental. Learn one skill until it's second nature, then add another. Start the garden before you get the goats. Master food preservation before you try to grow all your own produce. A young couple with a toddler on the husband's hip nodded vigorously. That's what we've been trying to tell our friends, the wife said. They think we're not committed enough because we still have regular jobs and just garden on weekends. But we're playing the long game. Exactly right, I confirmed. Self-sufficiency isn't a competition or a purity test. It's about building resilience step by step. Later that evening, as I sat on my porch watching fireflies rise from the darkening fields, Caramel prowling the perimeter of his territory, I reflected on my own incremental journey. The woman who had endured 15 slaps in silent shock now stood confidently before groups of strangers, sharing knowledge, answering questions, embodying a kind of authority I'd never imagined possessing. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had come through daily choices, to learn rather than retreat, to connect rather than isolate, to build rather than merely survive. Each small decision had reinforced the next, creating a foundation strong enough to support this new version of myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Got the promotion. Division manager now. Wanted you to be the first to know. I smiled, genuinely pleased for him. Our relationship remained cautious, defined more by what we didn't say than what we did. But there was a mutual respect developing, an adult-to-adult connection that felt healthier than the charged dynamics of our past. Congratulations, I texted back. You've worked hard for this. Proud of you. 3 dots appeared as he typed a response, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, that means a lot coming from you. Thanks, Mom. Such a simple exchange, yet it represented miles of invisible growth on both our parts. The mother who would have automatically praised any achievement regardless of merit was gone. The son who would have expected adulation as his due was fading. In their place, 2 people attempting honest communication, acknowledging effort, offering sincere appreciation. July melted into August, bringing the brutal heat Texas summers are famous for. The garden required daily watering despite the drought-resistant varieties I'd planted. The house with its high ceilings and strategic cross-ventilation remained relatively comfortable, but outdoor work became limited to early mornings and late evenings, with the punishing midday hours reserved for indoor projects or necessary rest. During one such forced afternoon retreat, sheltering from 100-degree temperatures, I received an unexpected call from Sarah Jenkins, the lawyer who had helped me sell the Houston house and establish my new legal identity in Texas. Susan, I hope I'm not disturbing you, she began, her professional tone immediately putting me on alert. I've received an inquiry that I thought you should know about. A journalist named Andrew Grant has been researching stories about women who've rebuilt their lives after domestic abuse. Your name came up through channels I'm still trying to identify. My heart rate accelerated. What did you tell him? Nothing, of course. Attorney-client privilege, but he seems quite determined. Said he heard about the woman who sold her house while her abuser was at work and wants to interview you for a book he's writing. I sank into a kitchen chair, mind racing. My story, which I'd shared only with Catherine, the farm women, and participants in our workshops, had somehow traveled beyond our circle. The thought of my private pain becoming public consumption sent a wave of nausea through me. I don't want any part of this, I said firmly. Please tell him I'm not interested. I will, Sarah assured me. But Susan, he mentioned he's already found Mark, interviewed him apparently. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Mark had spoken to a journalist about what happened, about the 15 slaps, about Jessica's laughter, about the house sale that had forced them out. What version of events had he shared? What narrative was being constructed without my input? After thanking Sarah and ending the call, I sat motionless at the kitchen table watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. The peace I'd so carefully constructed felt suddenly fragile, threatened by external forces I couldn't control. My instinct was to retreat further, to decline all future workshops, to withdraw from the tentative reconnection with Mark, to pull the protective shell of privacy more tightly around myself. Yet even as the impulse arose, I recognized its roots in my old patterns of avoidance and accommodation. The woman I was becoming wouldn't hide from uncomfortable truths. She would face them directly with the same clear-eyed determination she brought to clearing overgrown fields or replumbing ancient bathrooms. I called Mark that evening, dispensing with our usual cautious small talk. "A lawyer contacted me today about a journalist who's writing a book. She said you've already spoken with him." A heavy silence filled the line. Then, "I was going to tell you. I wanted to make sure of his intentions first." "His intentions?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. "What about my privacy, Mark? My right to decide who knows my business?" "Mom, I'm sorry. He approached me after an anger management session, said he was documenting stories of redemption and healing. I thought it might help other people like me. Show them there's a way back from being the villain in someone else's story." The genuine remorse in his voice deflated some of my anger. Mark wasn't deliberately exposing me. He was trying to make meaning from his own mistakes, perhaps even atone for them publicly. Still, the unilateral decision to share our family trauma struck a painful chord. "What exactly did you tell him?" I asked, fighting to keep my tone level. "The truth, that I abused you verbally for years, then physically, that you escaped by selling the house out from under me, that it was the wake-up call I needed." His voice cracked slightly. "I didn't paint myself as a victim, Mom. I own what I did." I closed my eyes, absorbing this. Whatever his intentions, Mark had opened a door I'd never intended to walk through, making our private pain a matter of public record, transforming my personal journey into a case study for others' education or entertainment. "I need time to process this," I said finally. "Please don't share anything more until I decide how I want to handle it." "Of course. And Mom, I really am sorry. I should have asked first." After hanging up, I walked outside despite the lingering heat. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, silhouetting the oak trees against the horizon. Caramel appeared from wherever he'd been hunting, winding around my ankles, before disappearing again into the gathering dusk. The journalist's interest presented a crossroads I hadn't anticipated. I could refuse the interview, allowing Mark's perspective to stand alone, potentially leaving my story incomplete or misrepresented. Or I could agree to speak, opening myself to scrutiny, but ensuring my voice was included in whatever narrative emerged. Neither option felt comfortable. Both required a kind of public vulnerability I'd spent decades avoiding. I called Martha, knowing she'd offer perspective untainted by emotional investment. As expected, she cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Sounds to me like you're facing the same choice you did when you left Mark, hide or stand up. Only difference is now you're a hell of a lot stronger." "It's not about strength," I protested. "It's about privacy. I didn't leave to become some inspirational story. I left to save myself." "And you did save yourself," Martha agreed. "But here's the thing about strength, Susan. It's not just for you. It's also for everyone watching who thinks they can't do what you did. Everyone who believes they're too old or too scared or too broke to walk away from people who hurt them." Her words settled into me, slowly raising uncomfortable questions about responsibility and example. Was my desire for privacy outweighed by the potential impact my story might have on others, trapped in situations similar to what I'd endured? Did successfully escaping create an obligation to show others the path I slept poorly that night? Wrestling with competing values of privacy and purpose. By morning, I'd reached no clear conclusion, but I had formulated a plan of action that honored my need for control while acknowledging the reality of the situation. I called Sarah and asked her to arrange a meeting with the journalist. Not for an interview, but for a conversation about boundaries and expectations. If my story was going to be told, I wanted input into how it was framed and what details were included. Andrew Grant agreed readily to meet at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in Austin where Catherine could join us as my support person. He arrived precisely on time, younger than I'd expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with an earnest expression and a notebook already open on the table. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for agreeing to meet," he began, extending his hand. "I understand your reservations, and I want to assure you my intentions are honorable." I shook his hand briefly, evaluating him with the directness I'd developed over months of assessing broken fences and failing irrigation systems. "Mr. Grant, I'm here to understand exactly what kind of book you're writing, and what role you envision my story playing in it. Over the next hour, Andrew explained his project, a collection of paired narratives from victims of domestic abuse and their abusers focused on the process of healing and, where possible, reconciliation, or at least mutual understanding. He had interviewed 5 couples so far, with Mark being his first solo interview, where the other half of the story remained untold. Your situation is particularly compelling, Andrew admitted, not just because of how you left, which was frankly brilliant, but because you've created such a meaningful new chapter. The workshop program you've developed, the community you've built, it's an extraordinary second act. I raised an eyebrow. You've been researching me beyond what Mark shared. Only public information, he assured me quickly. The Heritage Project has a website with your bio. There was also a small piece about your workshops in the university newsletter. Catherine leaned forward. What happens if Susan decides not to participate? Will you still include Mark's account? Andrew hesitated, then nodded. Honestly, yes. His story of accountability is valuable on its own, but it would be much stronger paired with yours, especially given how successfully you've rebuilt your life. I considered this, weighing options against intuition. Andrew seemed sincere, and his project aimed to educate rather than sensationalize. Mark had already shared his perspective, meaning some version of our story would be published regardless of my participation. The question was whether I wanted my voice included in that telling. I need conditions, I said finally. I choose which details are included. I approve the final text of any sections about me. And I remain anonymous. First name only, no location more specific than Texas Hill Country. Andrew nodded eagerly. Absolutely. Those terms are completely acceptable. And one more thing, I added. I want to include the other farm women, not individually, but as a collective force in my recovery. Their role was crucial, and any telling of my story that leaves them out is incomplete. I'd be honored to include them, Andrew agreed. Their perspective would add tremendous value. We set a date for a formal interview the following week to be conducted at my farmhouse with Catherine present. As we parted, Andrew handed me his card with a handwritten note on the back. Your story matters. Thank you for trusting me with it. I tucked the card into my pocket, still unsure if I'd made the right decision, but feeling a cautious optimism about the path forward. The interview, when it happened, proved both more difficult and more cathartic than I'd anticipated. Sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by the life I'd built from the ashes of the old one, I recounted the full arc of my marriage. Mark's gradual transformation, the 15 slaps that had finally shattered my acceptance of the unacceptable. Andrew listened without interruption, recording my words, occasionally making notes, but mostly maintaining steady eye contact that communicated genuine interest without judgment. When I described the moment of decision, the night I'd lain awake realizing the deed was still in my name, he nodded in recognition of the pivotal shift. That's the moment most of my subjects identify, he observed. Not when they physically leave, but when they mentally refuse to accept the situation any longer. The external action follows the internal decision, sometimes years later. For me, it was the same night, I confirmed. Once I knew I could leave, staying even one more day than necessary became unthinkable. The conversation extended beyond the painful past into my present reality. The farmhouse renovations, the garden's evolution, the Heritage Project's growing impact. Andrew seemed equally interested in the mechanics of rebuilding as he was in the trauma that had necessitated it. Would you say the abuse, as terrible as it was, ultimately led you to a better life? He asked toward the end of our session. The question gave me pause. I'd never framed my journey in those terms, never attempted to balance the ledger of pain against subsequent joy. To suggest the former justified the latter seemed too neat, too close to excusing what had happened. I'd say I built a better life despite the abuse, not because of it, I replied carefully. What happened clarified my choices, but the strength to make those choices was always within me. I just hadn't been forced to access it yet. Andrew nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. That distinction matters. Thank you. After he left, Catherine and I sat in the lengthening afternoon shadows, processing the emotional weight of the day. Are you okay? She asked, refilling our iced tea glasses. That was a lot to revisit. Strangely, yes. I watched a hummingbird dart among the salvias I'd planted near the porch steps. There's something, I don't know, validating about having someone bear witness to your experience, especially someone who understands it as part of a larger pattern, not just your personal drama. Do you think Mark was honest in his interview about his role? I mean, I considered this trying to set aside maternal bias and judge based on the man I now knew, not the son I'd always defended. I think he's trying to be. Whether he's capable of complete honesty about himself? That's a different question. The book project progressed through summer and into fall. Andrew sent drafts of the chapters featuring Mark and me, honoring his promise to let me review and suggest changes. To my surprise, Mark's account was brutally self-critical, sparing no detail of his escalating verbal abuse and the final physical attack. He described himself in terms I would have hesitated to use, acknowledging patterns of entitlement and control I hadn't fully recognized even while living through them. My own narrative, woven alongside his, provided context without excuses. Together, our parallel accounts created a more complete picture than either alone could have achieved. Not just of what had happened, but of how such dynamics develop gradually, almost imperceptibly, until they suddenly become unbearable. The farm women, true to form, declined individual recognition, but allowed their collective wisdom to be included as a critical element in my healing. Martha even provided Andrew with a list of practical resources for women seeking to leave abusive situations. Everything from legal aid contacts to tips for establishing credit independently. By the time the final manuscript was complete, nearly a year had passed since that first phone call from Sarah. In that time, the farmhouse renovations had been completed, the garden had produced 2 abundant harvests, and the Heritage Project had expanded to include monthly workshops in 3 counties with a waiting list of participants eager to learn traditional skills. Mark and I had continued our cautious reconciliation, speaking regularly by phone and occasionally by video call. He had seen pictures of the farmhouse and garden, but had never visited, a boundary I maintained despite his occasional hints about wanting to see my new life in person. Some distances I had learned were protective rather than punitive, creating space for both parties to evolve without the gravity of old patterns pulling them back. The book, titled After the Storm: Pathways to Healing from Domestic Violence, was scheduled for release in spring. Andrew had arranged a small advance publishing event at the university where Richard taught, featuring a panel discussion with several of the subjects, including Mark and me if we were willing. The invitation presented yet another decision point. Appearing publicly would definitively end any pretense of anonymity, at least locally. It would mean physically sharing space with Mark for the first time since I'd left, a prospect that still triggered a flutter of anxiety despite our improved communication. Yet it also offered an opportunity to embody the strength I'd been cultivating, to demonstrate physically, as well as verbally, that I had moved beyond victimhood into a life of purpose and agency. The woman who had endured 15 slaps in silent shock was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned to speak her truth without fear or apology. I called Mark directly to discuss the panel invitation, wanting to gauge his reaction before making my decision. "I've already told Andrew I'll participate," Mark said when I raised the subject. "But I completely understand if you'd rather not. It's a lot to ask." "It's not about what's being asked," I clarified. "It's about what message I want to send, to myself as much as to anyone else. Being in the same room with you, I need to know if that still holds power over me." A pause on his end of the line. "I hadn't thought about it that way. I guess I still have a long way to go in understanding your experience." The simple acknowledgement of his limited perspective, the lack of defensiveness in his response, confirmed how far he had come from the man who had towered over me in rage just 18 months earlier. Whether that growth was sufficient to risk physical proximity remained to be seen, but his willingness to accept my boundaries without argument suggested positive change. "I'll think about it," I promised. "And Mark, thank you for not pressuring me either way. That matters." In the end, the decision crystallized during an ordinary moment. Harvesting the last tomatoes before the first frost, my hands stained with soil and plant residue caramel, watching suspiciously from the garden fence. The simple, profound contentment of that activity, the tangible evidence of growth and nourishment I had cultivated from bare earth, settled something within me. The fear that had governed so many of my choices for so many years had lost its hold. Not completely, perhaps it never would, but sufficiently that the prospect of seeing Mark in a controlled public setting no longer triggered panic. I could face him now not as a victim facing her abuser, but as a woman who had transcended that chapter of her story. I called Andrew that evening and confirmed my participation in the panel discussion, with one condition: that Martha be invited to join as well, representing the community aspect of recovery. He agreed enthusiastically, recognizing the narrative value of including multiple perspectives. The event was scheduled for a Thursday evening in early March. As the date approached, I found myself surprisingly calm, focused more on the practical aspects of preparation. What to wear, how to articulate complex emotional experiences concisely, which examples from the Heritage Project might best illustrate the concept of reclaimed agency, than on anxiety about facing Mark. Catherine insisted on driving me to the University Protective as always. "Just remember you can leave at any point," she reminded me as we navigated through evening traffic. "You don't owe anyone your presence if it becomes too difficult." "I know." I smoothed the fabric of the simple blue dress I'd chosen. Professional without being formal, comfortable without being casual. "But I don't think it will be. This isn't about Mark anymore. It's about the story we're telling together. Not just him and me, but all of us who found ways to heal." The university auditorium was larger than I'd expected, already half filled with students, faculty, and community members when we arrived. Andrew met us in the lobby, his nervous energy betraying the importance of this event to his project's success. "Susan, thank you again for coming," he greeted me warmly. "The other panelists are in the green room. Martha's already there. Formidable woman, your friend." I smiled, picturing Martha undoubtedly holding court among the academics and publishing professionals. "She tends to make an impression." Catherine squeezed my arm. "I'll be in the front row if you need me. You've got this." With a deep breath, I followed Andrew down a side hallway to the green room where voices murmured behind a closed door. This was the moment. Crossing the threshold from private healing to public testimony, from personal journey to shared narrative. Whatever happened next, I would face it as the woman I had become, not the woman I had been. The door opened, and there stood Mark, looking both familiar and strange in a buttoned shirt and tie. His face more lined than I remembered, his posture lacking the aggressive confidence I'd grown to fear. Our eyes met across the small room, a universe of complicated history contained in that single moment of recognition. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly. I squared my shoulders, feeling the strength that had grown through months of physical labor and emotional excavation. "Hello, Mark. It's been a while." And with those simple words, we began the next chapter. Not as victim and abuser, not even as mother and son, but as two flawed humans attempting to extract meaning from shared pain, to transform private suffering into public understanding. Whatever came next, I knew this much for certain: I was no longer defined by what had happened to me, but by what I had built from its aftermath. The bruises had faded, the fear had diminished, and in their place had grown something I'd never expected to find at 61. Not just a new beginning, but a profound recognition that beginnings remained possible at any age, that strength could emerge from the most devastating blows, that dignity once reclaimed became an unshakable foundation for whatever life remained to be lived.